A terrible day in Ukraine. Awful scenes. Expectant mothers bombed, dead children under rubble. But there are some weirder aspects of the situation which we are going to be looking at tonight also. Conspiracy theories can still get you dumped from social media, even though the conspiracy theories turn out to be true. So we got some more on big tech censorship. And is Belgium the authoritarian hellhole we've all been waiting for? Plus your thoughts live and in real time. So do send them along by email to gbviews@gbnews.uk or via Twitter at GBNews. All that coming up after the news with the one and only Tamsin Roberts right now.
Mark, thank you. Good evening from the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister has called the reported bombing of a Ukrainian maternity hospital depraved. Ukraine's president says children are trapped under rubble after a Russian airstrike reportedly destroyed the hospital in the city of Mariupol. It's after the Kremlin agreed a ceasefire in the region to let civilians evacuate. Earlier, Ukraine's foreign minister accused Moscow of holding 400,000 residents hostage by shelling Mariupol, despite efforts to establish a safe evacuation corridor. The Foreign Secretary says the UK will supply Ukraine with anti-tank weapons and anti-air defence systems. Her comments come as the Ministry of Defence says Russia has confirmed the use of vacuum bombs in the conflict. Speaking at a press conference in Washington with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Liz Truss said a no-fly zone would lead to a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia.
We know that if we don't do enough now, other aggressors around the world will be emboldened. And we know that if Putin is not stopped in Ukraine, there would be terrible implications for European and global security. We would be sending a message that sovereign nations can simply be trampled on.
Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that the goal is to end the war and not to expand it.
Introducing, in our case, American service members in Ukraine, on Ukrainian territory or soil, or American pilots into Ukrainian airspace, whether on a full or on a limited basis, would almost certainly lead to direct conflict between the United States, between NATO, and Russia.
Boris Johnson says the number of Ukrainian refugees coming to the UK will rise sharply to hundreds of thousands in the coming weeks. Ukraine's ambassador to the UK says his officials will help to deal with refugees if the visa rules are lifted. But the Prime Minister says we must have checks to avoid unnecessary security risks. Meanwhile, Downing Street has announced a new visa processing centre in Lille in France, which will begin accepting appointments from tomorrow. This is GB News on TV, online and DAB+ radio. Now, let's get straight back to Mark Steyn.
From the geniuses at USA Today, fact check. False claim of US biolabs in Ukraine tied to Russian disinformation campaign. That's great to know. So it's just more Russian disinformation. That was from Ella Lee of USA Today on February the 25th. She's probably got her Pulitzer Prize by now. So yesterday in Washington, there was one of those boring congressional hearings nobody with anything better to do pays much attention to. Victoria Newland, who's the deputy assistant, under assistant deputy of whatever, was testifying. Senator Marco Rubio used most of his time to talk about Venezuela and then said,
I'm sure you're aware that the Russian propaganda groups are already putting out there all kinds of information about how they've uncovered a plot by the Ukrainians to release biological weapons in the country and with NATO's coordination. If there's a biological or chemical weapon incident or attack inside of Ukraine, is there any doubt in your mind that 100%?
It's the wrong clip. That was the wrong clip. There's supposed to be... Do we have the other clip? Nothing's working. Okay, that's great. That's the kind of control room you want. Well, there was one of these. There's one of these clips where she was asked about whether there were biological and chemical weapons in Ukraine, and she said yes, there were all these bio-research labs, and they were very concerned that these bio-research labs would be falling into the hands of Russian forces. These bio-research facilities are pursuant to a 2005 agreement between the US Department of Defense and the Ukrainian Ministry of Health. Again, just like Wuhan. Now, do we have that graphic? Do we have the graphic of the agreement between the 2005 agreement between the Pentagon and the Ukrainian Health Ministry? Do we have that one? Okay, nothing's working there. It's like we've already been seized by the Russians. USA Today is right in the sense that these are not technically US-owned labs, because the Pentagon is just picking up the tab for what are nominally Ukraine-owned labs conducting, quote, cooperative biological research. So it is just like the Wuhan Institute of Virology, except that this time it's Wuhan on the Dniester, the Wuhan of the Bukovina, Wuhan, the Black Sea Resort. Do we have this next clip? Let's see if we can play this one. Oh, okay, that's not working either. Anyway, here's the point. Neville Chamberlain. I should be doing a stage show. Neville Chamberlain, just open mic night. Neville Chamberlain famously described Czechoslovakia as a faraway country of which we know little. Ukraine is actually east of Slovakia, so in theory it's a farther away country of which we know even less. And yet Washington is up to its neck in Ukraine, sometimes just stealing from Ukraine by putting then Vice President Biden's son on the board of Burisma and loading him up with over 80 grand every month in a country where the then salary was $200 a month. Sometimes it's just the usual corruption, like Ukraine being the biggest source of foreign donations to the Clinton Foundation, because there's nothing Ukrainian billionaires like more, apparently, than paying $2 million for a speech by Chelsea Clinton about diarrhea in Africa. And sometimes it's something far murkier, involving the best connected foreign policy players in Washington. They're all very bipartisan, so elections don't really make much difference to their ascent. Victoria Nuland, who happens to be Ukrainian American by sheer coincidence, used to work for Dick Cheney, then Obama, now it's Biden. Likewise, her husband, Robert Kagan, used to advise John McCain and then Hillary Clinton. A decade ago, he wrote one of the most ludicrous books I've ever had the misfortune to read, The World America Made. Sample total blithering, fatuous codswallop, in quote. Just as the British could safely cede power to a rising United States, so Americans could have an easier time ceding some power and influence across the Pacific to a rising democratic China. So the transfer of global dominance from America to China is analogous to that of Britain to America. That kind of drivel is why Washington is going down the toilet of history faster than any great power not in a shooting war. So naturally, just as American taxpayers turn out to be funding gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has the same security protocols as the average dentist's room, they're also funding the artfully named Biological Threat Reduction Program in Ukraine. At the Lviv Research Institute of Epidemiology and Hygiene and the Pathogen Asset Control System. Although, unfortunately, all the linked fact sheet PDFs on the State Department website have been taken down since the war started. Washington is adamant that Putin is clinically insane. Putin sees Washington funding clinics on his border and thinks that Washington is insane. In a land of nuts, who doesn't get shelled? Fortunately, as we know from Afghanistan, our nuts are way more sophisticated than their nuts. You can let me know what you think. I think the email's still working. gbviews@gbnews.uk or via Twitter at GBNews. Hans Mankey writes at the Epoch Times and elsewhere and has been following all this very closely. Hans, I don't want to make too much of what Victoria Nuland said, but there does not seem to me to be a very clear reason why the Pentagon and the Ukrainian Health Ministry should be in bed together as they apparently are.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And the point that, and your viewers will see that in the full clip, that a lot of people missed is Rubio asked a very simple question, as you mentioned. Does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons? He expected a one-word answer. There can only be a one-word answer, and that answer is no. And then, of course, Nuland didn't give that answer. Instead, she sort of started rambling on, very, in a lot of discomfort, evidently. And then Rubio had to jump in sort of 20 seconds later and interrupt her and basically kind of clean up the situation. Now, the broader point, of course, is why is Washington involved in all these ventures, in these labs? And you mentioned Wuhan, obviously now Ukraine, other places as well. We don't know. I mean, I would say, however, that there's a very interesting note about this whole topic, which probably has been missed so far. Back in November of 2021, Washington and Ukraine signed a charter for a strategic partnership. I don't think many people have sort of dug into that. And that charter talks about all kinds of things, very problematic in many ways. Some might say it sort of poked the bear in the eye and that kind of thing. But there's a part in there that talks about weapons of mass destruction. And there's a sentence in there that says that the United States and Ukraine pledge to combat the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And then it goes on to say that they will also secure advanced technologies together. No one knows exactly what that means, but it's certainly very odd that Washington gets involved in various places, and the fact that they put that in this charter, I thought that was very odd.
Yes, and if you're looking at it from Putin's point of view, and this isn't to be pro-Putin, he just reduced a hospital to rubble today. He's not a nice guy. But the secret to winning wars, as opposed to losing them, which is what the Pentagon mostly does, is to try and get into the thinking of your enemy. And if you were Putin, this is really a bit like Washington waking up and finding out that Russia is doing all kinds of weird research at Canadian labs at Niagara Falls, Ontario, or in Thunder Bay, or in Chicoutimi, or wherever it is. And that would disquiet Washington, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it certainly would. And we don't know what they were doing in those labs. Nuland's answer was very peculiar, of course, because, as I mentioned, she could have just said, no, they don't have those kinds of weapons. But she didn't say that. Hopefully, we'll find out more about what's going on there. But I certainly agree that just as much as it would have... imagine if at the Ottawa protests last month, imagine that you had Sergei Lavrov showing up and kind of egging on the protesters and things like that. You had that situation going on in Ukraine 8 years ago in 2014, again, with the same person, Victoria Nuland, involved at the time. So there's sort of a pattern of kind of Washington really kind of jumping into Ukraine matters. And I absolutely agree. Putin's not a nice guy. No one's saying he's a nice guy. Neither is Xi Jinping. But those are the ones we have to deal with. You don't deal with nice people all the time. So, I completely agree that, Washington is just has its hands in all these things. I mean, think of Hunter Biden. You mentioned him earlier. As soon as the 2014 Maidan revolution occurred and the democratically elected president Yanukovych was replaced with a new guy, Nuland's guy, where did Burisma's owner, Zolszewski, where did he turn for protection? Normally, you turn for protection in your own government. You pay someone off or whatever. No, he turned to Biden. He turned to the United States. That kind of gives you an insight into the level of intermingling between U.S. and Ukrainian affairs, even 8 years ago.
Well, just let's connect some of the things that have been happening today. That terrible crater where part of that hospital was, and we're told that there are children under this rubble. Or if you look at Chernobyl, where they've unplugged it, so there's actually radiation inside the facility. They think they can keep it inside the facility without it getting out, but who knows? And a lot of this seems to be, if you're on the receiving end of that shelling, the weirdest thing about it is that all these powerful Americans have been monkeying around in Ukraine for the last decade or so. I paraphrase Neville Chamberlain, a faraway country of which we know little. But in fact, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, the Bidens, the Clintons, Victoria Nuland, every big shot Washingtonian is on the ground in Ukraine at some time or other this last decade. What's up with that?
Indeed, what is up with that? I don't think you can excuse in any way, obviously, what Putin did. But there is clearly a path that involves U.S. government officials that at least helped create this situation. And that goes back probably to 2008, when George W. Bush promised Ukraine NATO membership, which everyone knew in the U.S. government that was a red line. In fact, the current CIA director, Biden CIA director, Bill Burns, he stated very clearly that NATO membership for Ukraine was the brightest of red lines. So kind of everyone knew that. But nonetheless, everyone kind of still kind of kept egging on the case. Just late last year, you had Lloyd Austin, Defense Secretary, flying over there, promising, open doors to NATO. Blinken did the same thing. Biden did it as recently as December of 2021, when the troops were already amassing. So, what is up with that? What is this involvement with Washington? I don't have the answers, but certainly that's something to reflect upon as we kind of look at the wider situation here.
Well, thank you very much for that, Hans. It is amazing that, as I said, the gap between the conspiracy theory and humdrum reality is getting shorter and shorter. What was the United States government, what was the Pentagon doing in Ukraine all these years? You've been one of the best and one of the first on that aspect of the case, and I think we need to know a lot more, because right now it's the people of Ukraine who are on the receiving end of the consequences of whatever that strategy was meant to achieve. We're going to get to your reaction next. That's gbviews at gbnews.uk. You can tweet me at gbnews. But even if they're true, by the way, these conspiracy theories on COVID can still get you bounced from Twitter, as has just happened to my next guest. Lots more fun stuff straight ahead. Don't go anywhere. We're coming right back. Where'd you go? We don't have any sound. Question, because we've had the man-made disease for the last 2 years, escaped from the lab, killed millions of people, and now we're coming up for the nuclear Armageddon, which I think is scheduled for, what is it, the second week in April, something like that. So we're getting both of them. Anyway, Esther says, nuclear Armageddon, obviously, the false, stupid. The fallout lasts 10,000 years, said Esther. The Black Death, on the other hand, at its peak, was gone in a few years, and the population other Black more specific, Mackenzie, you're talking about the big bearded Ayatollahs in Tehran or these some of these wackier Church of England guys? You've got to be more specific about the religious fanatics you have in mind. Curtis says the politicians and media that try to manufacture hysterical public fear of these things in order to increase their power and control. That's true. We've had the disease come out of Wuhan, and it looks like when the final tally is all added up, that as much as it may have killed millions around the world, it didn't actually do anything worse than the excess mortality we have and the increase in child suicide and all the old people who died because they didn't get their treatments, and all the people who've got stage 4 cancer because they didn't get diagnosed back when it was stage 2. So you might have a point there. Chris says the man-made disease called liberalism easily kills more people. It's worse than nuclear Armageddon. It's so Chris's point is that liberalism, your typical lefty with his political beliefs, that is like a giant mushroom cloud outside your window, but the mushroom cloud forms very slowly. That's the problem, Chris. It forms so gradually people don't really notice it until it's too late. And William, of course, comes up with the correct answer as to what's the bigger threat to Europe. He says, my wife's cooking could take out a hemisphere. That's very good, William. We might read out your full name and address just so your wife can get mad at you. The political class in Britain, America, Europe is trying to back off the COVID stand ledge because they don't. The thought police at social media don't appear to have gotten the memo because they're still banning and cancelling and closing down those who dissent from the 2020 COVID narrative. Among them is Kathy Ginchel. You can read Kathy at The Conservative Woman, which is just as well, because right now you can't read her on Twitter. It's always great to see Kathy. Before we get to any of the other stuff, tell us why you had your Twitter account vaporized earlier today.
A message from Twitter that said I was sort of guilty of COVID misinformation and that they'd locked me out. And I thought, what have I tweeted this time? I certainly hadn't tweeted anything rude or inaccurate, certainly no conspiracy theories. Anyway, I rolled down the tweet, and it was for a blog I'd written yesterday, which introduced or reiterated a story about the suppression of Ivamektin as a treatment for COVID. It's a story that's been going a long time, and I probably don't want to bore you with the sort of total story, but it goes back to about October 20, when it was discovered, various research papers discovered, good research papers done by very reputable scientists in England, one from Liverpool, that ivermectin was extremely effective in bringing down hospitalizations and death, effective for early treatment and hospitalized treatment. And it was amazing categorical research. And this is a drug that costs nothing because it's been kicking around for years and years and years. Anyway, very quickly.
But that's the.
I can't hear you,
Kathy, because it. Because, well, I couldn't hear you for a bit, but I can hear you now. But wait a minute, they'll be able to sort that out. But just let me interrupt you there, Kathy, because the thing about ivermectin is there's no money in it for big pharma and all, because as you say, it's been around forever. So there's no big bucks in it for the pharmaceutical companies. But what I find interesting is you put in a good word for ivermectin, which hundreds of thousands of people in Britain and America and Europe would be alive today.
Absolutely.
If they'd actually taken ivermectin in the early stages of this. And in fact, the great state of New Hampshire is about to pass a bill making ivermectin, making it mandatory for every pharmacist in the state to carry ivermectin and to make it available without prescription. So I don't understand why Twitter are still enforcing 2020 rules.
No, let me tell you, I didn't get to the full story. I didn't just put in a good word for it. I've been doing that for a long time on the basis of the research. A film has been made, an extraordinarily powerful film. My blog was a link to a film that's just been released by Oracle Films, featuring Dr. Tess Lawrie, who has uncovered what's going to turn out to probably one of the major scandals of the COVID period treatment. And it relays basically how the research was the conclusions drawn from the research were effectively rewritten by people who were funding the research institute. So it's a story about Unitaid, it's a story about Bill Gates, and it's a story that gets to the heart of the corruption of science that's been going on. And it's deeply significant, Mark, because what it means, and I'm going to have to read this out because I don't want to get it wrong, and it is important. The decision not to advocate ivermectin, but instead to say further trials were needed, to kick the can down the road, it basically led to the censoring and discrediting of the doctors recommending it. These were very reputable, good doctors. It facilitated the authorization of the experimental gene therapy. They absolutely, my reading is of it, they did not want an effective treatment around when they were just going to try and rush out an experimental gene therapy that everyone was going to be made to have. And it was fundamentally instrumental. This particular episode that she relays in the film, very, very carefully, incredibly well documented, shows how ivermectin was repressed. It's still repressed in this country. Interesting what you say about the state in America. But so it's a bit more than me putting in a good word for it. It was taken off YouTube within minutes. Other people who've promoted this film have also been locked off Twitter. So it's a slightly more worrying story.
No, I take that point, but I brought up what the state of New Hampshire is doing. As I said, they're about to pass a law making it mandatory for every pharmacy, for the New Hampshire equivalents of Boots the Chemist, to carry ivermectin and to make it available to anyone who wants it without prescription. So I don't understand how Facebook and Twitter can continue their campaign, because effectively they'd be having to cancel New Hampshire legislators who mentioned this new law.
Yeah, but I don't think they want the corruption uncovered. I'm sorry, that perhaps makes me sound a bit like a conspiracy theorist, but I think it's more than that. Yes, it happens, and actually it probably should be by prescription because dosage is important. You know, American states are much freer than we are. And people over here are having to get their prescriptions from India or whatnot. I just know somebody recently, but he went to a doctor friend to get him to advise on the dose he should take. It shouldn't be like that. I'm not sure. You know, I think it requires a prescription if you're ill, but that's another matter. But I think the scandal in this, the particular researcher, professor, 4 days after he put out the report that said, oh dear, no, ivermectin, really, we can't go forward with it, basically. I've got to be careful what I say here. The major charity, or whatever we call it, Bill and Melinda Gates funded charity, poured in another load of money into his research project's account. So this is, I think, why that they're knocking me off and they're knocking the film off. I might be wrong. and it's a tricky area.
How did we arrive in a world? I've spent 2 years, and I don't pay any attention to Bill Gates. I don't think I've used Bill Gates since Windows 98, and that was such a ghastly experience. I haven't wanted to go anywhere near any Bill Gates product ever again. So I don't use him, I don't think of him. But I noticed just throughout the last 2 years, every 6 or 7 weeks, I'll just be roaming around the internet or opening a newspaper, and there'll be a photograph of Bill Gates meeting with a senior Western politician. It might just be a health minister, might be a prime minister. And I don't understand why Bill Gates gets in to see Her Britannic Majesty's Principal Secretary of State for Health, and you
and the Prime Minister
don't.
Whenever he wants.
Except that Bill Gates has a boatload of money and so can buy his way into the room with all these prime ministers.
Again, it's got a little more complex than that. He's the second biggest funder, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to the World Health Organization. He has extraordinary power. He's been behind the setting up of all the major Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance groups. This has been he's had an ongoing global vaccination project, even pre-COVID, and his tentacles are everywhere if you examine the funding of science in British universities. I mean, I think he even gave we used to have something called Public Health England. I literally can't keep up, the Quangos changed their names so quickly, but I think he even dropped out 11 million quid to that at some point. Gosh, I think I'm going to be sued tonight. I'm probably saying things that I shouldn't. But one thing that is true, he's been very generous with his money throughout institutions and media in this country. And this is
I don't know what Public Health England has changed its name. It's basically in the witness protection programme now, isn't it? It's been given facial reconstruction surgery and a new identity somewhere else.
It's been called the UK Health. It's something like, it's now all about security now. So health has suddenly come about. It's all about security. I mean, it's all very unnerving when you really follow what's going on.
You could call the 24-hour helpline, which I think is in the South Sandwich Islands. Thank you very much, Kathy. We didn't get to what we were meant to talk about, so we'll have you back and do it properly. We'll do that another time. Reactivate her Twitter account, you sick control freaks. By the way, if and on a related theme, if you live in Scotland or Ireland or Western Australia or Quebec, you might have noticed over the last 2 years a massive curtailment of your liberties, such as the right to leave your house or have granny round for a sherry. But don't worry, says The Guardian, it could be much worse. You could be Belgian. Noah Carl from the Daily Skeptic joins me now. Noah, this is basically a guide to where there's been the biggest loss of liberty over the last 2 years, and somehow the Guardian's team discovered that it was Belgium. Is that correct?
Hi, Mark. Yeah, good to be with you. They produced a map of Europe with different shades corresponding to different levels of violation of democratic freedoms. And red meaning more violations, blue meaning less. And what they show in their map is that all the countries that had democratic violations were in Eastern Europe. And the only one in Western Europe that had any democratic violations was Belgium. This is during the course of the pandemic. And you might have thought that's a rather strange thing to say, given that almost every Western country in Europe had a lockdown. There were mandatory stay-at-home orders. There were forced business closures. There were restrictions on visiting friends and family. Yet, according to The Guardian, Belgium's the only country in Western Europe that saw moderate democratic violations.
And as you pointed out, we've had other countries, Austria, for example, criminalized the unvaccinated and were actually moving towards a regime. They passed a law where you could be put in jail for not getting vaccinated. But even in France, where you can't go and get a little café au lait and chocolatine without having your vaccine pass. That too is an undoubted curtailment of liberty. Why was Belgium singled out then?
Well, the article didn't go into a great deal of detail, but it was something to do with discrimination against a particular demographic group within Belgium. So it seems that what may have happened is that the data they relied on to produce this map, which is one ought to be rather suspicious of for the reasons I've given, that data seemed to be more related to discrimination or alleged discrimination than fundamental curtailments of liberties and civil rights, such as the right to go and visit a friend or the right to have your business open for customers, etc.
So basically the Guardian doesn't regard having the right to determine how many people you have round to your house for dinner, or doesn't regard being able to leave the house only on the government's say-so. The Guardian apparently doesn't regard those as curtailments of liberty.
Well, yes, it's hard to know. I suppose they might say that all those restrictions that were put in place on Western European populations were put in place through democratic mechanisms. So they're not actually restrictions of democratic rights at all. Of course, one could respond to that by saying, well, not everything that a democracy does is really consistent with what a broad understanding of democratic rights entails. For example, 51% of people can't vote to shoot the other 49%.
No, I think, although I seem to remember the Guardian always used to go on about how the whole problem with the National Socialist Party in Germany was that it had come to power by constitutional and democratic means after an election. So they had a problem with that, but they don't seem to have a problem with an elected government telling you when you can actually leave your flat and go for a walk. Very interesting. Thank you, Noah. You can read Noah at The Daily Skeptic, and you should check in on The Daily Skeptic because they live up to their name. Stump the Stein's up and coming. You can ask me anything, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can Twitter me at gbnews. Coming up, she was on the show yesterday and people liked her very much. Ukrainian MP Inna Sovsun returns. Don't touch that dial. We'll see you in a minute. We spoke yesterday with Ukrainian MP Inna Sovson specifically about Polish jets that were to be dropped off at a US airbase in Germany and then sent to Ukraine to help defend against the Russians. A lot has changed in the last 24 hours in the skies and on the ground, so we brought Inna back. And we're very grateful to her for joining us again. Inna, before we get to that, what's the situation at the hospital where the scenes look absolutely the size of that crater? I mean, this cannot be accidental. As we just talked about yesterday, they're firing on nothing but civilian targets. They're firing on apartment blocks, they're firing on kindergartens, and they're firing on hospitals. Is there any word on the situation at the hospital?
On that hospital in Mariupol, they're still trying to figure out if people died or not. So we do not have any exact information on the number of casualties. We just have seen the pictures of people being saved from the hospital. So that was a children's hospital, but that it also had the maternity ward. So there were many pregnant women over there. So I have seen those terrible pictures of pregnant women leaving the hospital, their faces covered in blood, but luckily those are alive. But we are still learning about the situation over there. I've seen a desperate video recorded by the mayor of the city of Mariupol, and he's completely devastated. He's saying that this is an act of evil, an act of monster doing that, targeting the children. And this was, as you can see, the level of damage done that was specifically targeted. It was specifically targeted with some serious missile, and that is just inhumane what they did. I just do hope that people did manage to hide in the bomb shelter, and we wouldn't know about too many casualties. But I think they're still learning about that. But while we were still trying to figure out if people died in that in Mariupol, we learned about another missile attack in the city of Zhytomyr. And again, we are still learning about what happened there, but it seemed like in Zhytomyr they were targeting the infrastructure, the heating stations. That is what they're targeting. And this is happening every day, and we never know where it's going to hit next. And every day we wake up and we learned about the next missile strike with people dead, including children. Like, not a single night has passed that we didn't learn about the death of children here in Ukraine, and that's just terrifying. This morning, 2 babies under the age of 1 were killed in another missile strike. That's just terrifying.
Yeah, it's absolutely horrible to see some of these pictures of the children lying in the street dead, and to know that these are conscious choices made by a very powerful military not to take on other militaries and not to take on military targets, but to just look at the map, see where the children's hospital is, and put a missile through it. Absolutely incredible. Meanwhile, we have Western nations that are still sort of talking about helping you as if it's something they should have a meeting about next week and then maybe take a vote in 3 weeks' time and then maybe ship you something at the end of April. You were rather critical about Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, when he said that Ukraine was an inspiration to the world. And you snapped back that you don't want to be an inspiration, you want your normal lives back. And instead now everyone's just wearing the little flag pins and saying how fantastic and inspiring you are, but you actually need some practical help.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I appreciate all the support we are getting from the people. And we are seeing that people are truly supportive of the Ukrainians and our fight against the Russians. But from the world leaders, we expect something more. We don't expect them to record videos saying that they love and support Ukraine. We don't expect them just to wear blue and yellow clothes. We actually want some action, because people are dying daily on hourly basis here in Ukraine. In the afternoon today, the mayor of Mariupol has done some calculation, and he said that in the city of Mariupol, from the first day of war, over 1,000 people died because of the blockade, because people do not have access to water, don't have access to electricity, to heating. That is a genocide. And we cannot react to that slowly by conducting debates and, thinking what is the best way to do that. And it seems that the West is thinking, what is the best way to help Ukraine so that not to make the situation worse? How much worse can it get? Just 2 hours ago, we learned from the British media, actually, that the British intelligence is saying that the Russians are saying that Ukrainians might be using the chemical bombs in Ukraine. That is, of course, making no sense, but that does mean that the Russians are preparing the informational background for using the chemical weapons here in Ukraine. And the prospect of that is just terrifying. It's mind-numbing. It's so scary being here and knowing that we can be targets of that attack by the chemical weapons. I can't understand how people can be conducting negotiations and why people are still concerned that this argument that I still hear, like, if we get involved, Putin will react and he will attack us. What needs to be understood is that Putin does not need a real reason to attack. If he wants to attack, he will attack. He can say that, Swedish flag is the same colors as Ukrainian, so Swedes are supportive of Ukrainian Nazi regime, so I'm going to attack them. He doesn't really need a reason. Like, he didn't need a reason to attack us. And that is extremely important to understand. If he decides to attack, he will attack. The only way he will not attack if he will see the strong response. He does not respond to weakness. He only responds to strength, and that is what the whole world needs to understand and to figure out, that this is the only way to react against Putin.
Well, and it's also clear that's why he bombs hospitals and children's hospitals, is that he doesn't care what the world thinks. Are you upset about this Polish situation? It's not clear to me quite how it got into the mess it did, but it's the sort of thing that should have been done quietly between Washington and Warsaw. And instead, for some reason, it was all over the newspapers and TV and radio. And it would have been easy for those 29 MiGs just to be delivered quietly to Ukraine for Ukraine's pilots to use. And it doesn't look like that's going to happen now. Are you angry about that?
Well, I'm looking at pictures of dead Ukrainian children, and I try to imagine the pain of the parents, and I just wish someone tried to explain to the parents of those kids what are the technical reasons why we cannot deliver those MiGs to the Ukrainian pilots. I'm sorry, that is just unacceptable. That is not what the Western civilization is built upon. We cannot be negotiating on the price of the human life. And that is what is happening right now. We still have hope that some deal will be struck and we shall finally get those MiGs. Because you see what they're doing from air, bombarding cities, bombarding hospitals, bombarding schools. They have destroyed more than 200 schools in Ukraine as of now. That they are like those monsters that we need to react against jointly. And yes, we are frustrated that the deal with the Polish side has been stuck as of the moment. I hope it is stuck and not completely gone, but every day of delay is resulting in more and more victims of Putin. So we really hope for faster response from all sides.
Well, it's really every hour of delay. What you need to happen is for some of these Western ministers who've said, "Oh yes, we're thinking of sending some anti-air defenses to Ukraine," to say, no, we actually sent them yesterday and they're arriving this afternoon. We need action now and not talk. That's the Ukrainian way of looking at it, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. They are killing us here, like in great numbers. They are threatening our lives. They're threatening our children. And I really want the West to react faster. It's unacceptable. I'm representing the most pro-European, pro-Western party in the parliament. We have always trusted that the West will actually act according to the values that it proclaims. And now we do feel betrayed that we are left to fight against this evil, this barbaric civilization, this barbaric nation on our own.
Well, hang on in there, Inna, and stay safe. We're thinking about you. It's incredible to think that it's not even 2 weeks since life in these cities was perfectly normal. People were walking around, going and having a coffee and meeting friends. And now there's missiles coming through the windows and blowing the places apart. Stay safe, Inna. It's always good to see you, and we'll talk again. Let's get to some of your questions in the final moments of the show for Stump the Steyn. I like this one. I've noticed you always call Margaret Thatcher Mrs. Thatcher instead of Lady Thatcher. Why is that? Well, I'll tell you why that is if you really want to know. One of the very few pieces of advice I ever gave to Mrs. Thatcher was to tell her not to take that crappy life peerage. Mrs. Thatcher was a great lady, a very great lady, and she was entitled to the traditional gift of retiring prime ministers, which is the earldom. And she would be countess in her case. The earldom is what Harold Macmillan took and Anthony Eden took and so forth. That's the traditional gift to a retiring prime minister. And if anyone deserved it, it was her. And to have the same crappy old life peerage that people like Jim Callaghan and Harold Wilson got is just an insult to her. She achieved greatness as Mrs. Thatcher, and she will always be Mrs. Thatcher to me. But as I said, I didn't get to offer a lot of advice to Mrs. Thatcher, but that is one bit I did. She and I used to be on telly a zillion years ago on the Sunday morning breakfast show that David Frost did. I used to be on with Mrs. Thatcher's dear old daughter Carol, everyone's favourite Thatcher. We were like the Eamon and Isabel of our day. I gave her belly laughs, which was important to her first thing in the morning. Where did I get that from? Anyway, that's a great question. Another says, any chance you can take a page from Andrew Bonar Law's book and stand for Prime Minister of the UK? Yes, I pointed out a couple of weeks ago that, in fact, Her Majesty's subjects anywhere in our great Commonwealth family are entitled to sit in the British Parliament and rise to the cabinet and become Prime Minister, as Andrew Bonar Law did from Canada's beautiful maritime provinces. But I was mentioning it with respect to Tony Abbott, the former Australian Prime Minister, who's currently on the British Board of Trade. So he's already got a foot in UK politics, and I was urging Tony to go for it. And if there's going to be a Tory leadership contest, then it should definitely be Tony Abbott who goes for it. Owen says, will we start treating the letter Z like the swastika when all is said and done? Well, people are being kicked out. I wasn't terribly up to speed on this. I didn't realise that, but we're becoming such an illiterate society that actually abolishing letters of the alphabet is a logical step for us. And we're starting at the far end, so the Z. There was some Russian guy who got kicked out of a tennis competition. Was it Wimbledon or something? He got kicked out of something because he had a Z on his sports shirt. So we're now eliminating letters of the alphabet because they're too close to Putin. Z was getting too close to Putin, but it could be P or Q next. If it's one of the vowels, we're in real trouble because we'll turn into a race of grunting, moronic nitwits even faster than we're already turning into one. Albie says, how on earth did our leaders let us get into this situation in regards to Russian oil and gas? Go ask Boris. Boris is the one who's kissing up to Greta Thunberg by going for net zero. Greta Thunberg is never going to like him. She's always going to think he's a rotter. And she's always going to stand there and go, how dare you? So kissing up to Greta Thunberg is never going to get these guys anywhere. Andrew says, are you worried the criminal world will be taking advantage of the current situation in Europe? Well, with all due respect to Inna's lovely country, it has actually one of the worst crime rates in Europe. There's a lot of crime syndicates operating there, and I don't just mean the Clinton and the Biden families, but basically the crime, it's got a Russian rate of crime at the eastern end, and then the western end is kind of low level. That'll do it for me.